The inspiration for this presentation was a vacation that I took this summer. I love to travel, and I love to travel to our country's national parks. So for the first time in my life as a Texan, I went down to visit Big Bend, and I had a fantastic trip with two of my closest friends. But although I was there, in the capacity of a tourist, I can't seem to take off my economic goggles. I'm always looking through the world with the perspective of an economist. So I made observations while I was there, and those observations that I thought about came in handy when this lecture series was introduced to me, and I thought that this might be a pretty keen way to share my trip and the things that I saw on that trip from my discipline, which is economics. So as Scott said, the title of this is The Border Economy. I thought that looking at three of the main debate topics of the border economy would let you know which border I'm talking about. So when we're talking about walls, when we're talking about severe weather, and when we're talking about immigration, we are more than likely talking about the border between the United States and Mexico versus the United States and Texas, okay? This is a picture that I took. It's standing on the US side, but that's the Rio Grande, so that's Mexico on the other side there. Unadulterated. You can see for miles in this picture, right? Crossing over, just about a half mile down, there's a pedestrian crossing at Boquillas, and you can go over on a rowboat. And once you get to the small town of Boquillas del Carmen, it's set up in order to satisfy every American consumer's dream: retail, retail, and more retail. So there are fantastic foods to taste. There are artisan crafts to sample as well. But most of all, there are the people that you get to interact with. Along the border region, we often discount the importance of that binational relationship in which two countries are working together every single day, and how we can go down and explore and enjoy some of that cross-culturalism. So let's begin with the first topic, weather along the border system. I think that when we talk about weather today, the two words that probably jump to mind first are climate change. Everyone is talking about climate change. What causes climate change? Is it caused by us? And if it is there something that we can do about it? Well, how do we know that the climate today is different from the climate before? There's an entire discipline for that called Paleo Climatology. So we look at records that are left by people. The very first colonizers that came to Texas were the Spanish, and they came on ships. Oftentimes, their ships encountered hurricanes. If they didn't end up at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, they wrote about it in their captain's logs, and that's how we know the history of hurricanes in this area. We also have natural records that we can pull from trees, from rocks, from ice, if we can find any this far south. Chemical records. How do we know that plants and animals are different today from what they were previously? And of course, we have instrumental records, but only going back about 120 years when we first started using thermometers. So what we have found is that the rate of temperature change has increased in the last 50 years, and it's increasing even more. Well, why have global average surface temperatures begun to rise? So here is a chart that I found on NASA's website. This is talking about how greenhouse gases have increased since a major economic event in our history, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is when economies changed to look the way that we know them today in modern times. Before the Industrial Revolution, all that we could produce came out of the ground. Anything that you consumed was probably something that you could make for yourself or barter to get. But the beauty of the Industrial Revolution is that we no longer needed to depend on people to produce every single thing that we needed. We were able to use machines, and machines could produce, could take the crops from a field faster than a person could. The machine with the cotton gin, the steel mill, all of these machineries that allowed us to automate our production really changed how much production we engaged in. With machines, we could do so much more. So that's what 1750 represents right here, the start of the Industrial Revolution. And what these lines represent are methane gases, which is a type of greenhouse gas, and also carbon dioxide, two things that we do not want a lot of in our environment. From 1750 all the way to just beyond 2000, we see that there's definitely an upward slope here for both of these. I'm not saying that they're caused by production, machinery, and further automation, but there is a correlation. So, does capitalism cause climate change? Does more market activity, more building, more development, does it cause climate change because we are emitting more of these gases into the economy? Well, the answer is no. Capitalism can no more tell carbon dioxide how much of it should concentrate in the atmosphere than I can, right? But there is a correlation. Economies that become larger, that become more productive, their needs change. They need more than just the crops to come out of the ground or the clothes to go on their back, but we need cars and we need televisions and another television on top of that and a vacation and a second vacation home for when I'm not up north during the rest of the year. And all of these things require something that very advanced economies all need, and that is energy. So where we get our energy from does impact the climate. And if we are focused on energy that is going to be used and by combusting fossil fuels, then yes, human activity will have an impact on the environment that will be irreversible. Follow-up question. Can capitalism help mitigate the effects of climate change? And the answer to that is absolutely. Capitalism is a type of system that is built on incentives. Consumers want to satisfy their desire with a trip to Big Ben, with a second home, with another car or another television. Businesses, they want to maximize their profits. And so we need there to be an incentive in place to encourage people to care more about the environment than they do about what goods and services they're purchasing or what profits that they may be pursuing at the time. So let's consider climate change specifically along the southern border. There are certain challenges and opportunities that present themselves. The first challenge has to do with the people, the living organisms, the biodiversity along the southern region. There is an incredible amount of diversity. I mean, I have pictures from Big Bend where there are maybe 20 different types of just cactus. And then there are all the insects, there are all of the reptiles, you have bears, mountain lions, you have desert area, you have low basin, you have riverbed, and then you have the high Chisos mountains and forests. There's so much diversity in this area and along the United States border. Not only when it comes to animals, but we also have different populations of people there that may not be as prevalent within the United States in the interior area. I'm talking about tribes and tribal communities that have been there for hundreds of years and have maintained their production techniques, agricultural and otherwise, by ranching the land in this region. So when it says uneven economic development, we need to understand that there are some parts of the border that really look like moonscapes, like some place that's just kind of barren, nothing's growing there, but you've got other parts that are vibrant, other parts that need to be conserved and that we need to be concerned about. So there's opportunity here for capitalism to come up with increased conservation efforts. How are we making biodiversity, what type of environment are we providing and investing in such that biodiversity and the special populations down there can thrive? Also, having consideration for traditional farming and ranching cultures. This is not exactly a role of capitalism. Capitalism does not necessarily have feelings, okay? But in a capitalist economy and being the largest capitalist economy in the entire universe, we can set the standard as to how and what type of investment that we're going to make for our populations. Oh, sorry about that. Another challenge. Along the border, we have higher poverty rates, greater food insecurity, and more water scarcity. Again, capitalism can come into play here by looking at irrigation techniques and what type of agricultural ranching techniques might be of use and adaptable to the populations around the border. Both nations, being the United States and Mexico, we grow at different rates, and this is very important. as long as the economies of the United States and Mexico are very different from each other, the need and the desire to cross the border, whether it's to spend money as Americans do or to search for jobs as the Mexicans do, is always going to be present. So these economic asymmetries also present an opportunity for us for increased governance and increased infrastructure between the two nations. Governance is also not capitalism as well. When we think about capitalism, we think about markets functioning and doing what's best for the buyers and the sellers. But good governance will take into account both market activity and also the government intervention that needs to happen for both nations to thrive. Finally, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the potential for disrupted trade because this particular border region is one of the most productive and important suppliers of automotive goods, electronic goods, aerospace goods in the entire world. So in order to maintain the benefits that both countries get from trade along the border, we're going to need to work together, and we're going to need to do so within the free market structure. In Texas, when we talk about hurricanes, the most vulnerable populations are, first of all, those that are very rich, okay? People who want to escape to a warmer climate, if they have the income to do so, they'll move down to Florida, they'll move to Colorado, they'll buy a second home in a nice balmy area, and they'll stay there. So because there are retirees with lots of income that may be moving towards warm, more tropical areas of the United States, or at least that imitate that type of weather system, developers know that this is a lot of potential profit that's coming their way, right? So oftentimes, there may be very disproportionate incentives that subsidize developers for putting people in coastal areas that may not be very good places to build. They could be places that are on unstable hills, places that are on eroding coastlines. What we saw during the Katrina hurricane in New Orleans is that there are many people that were inside of the city that were vulnerable to when the dam opened up. And so most of those people were part of a certain income level that did not allow them to make market decisions where they would stay otherwise on higher ground. And then we see that being the opposite in what we just saw with Hurricane Harvey in Houston. There were several people that I talked to on a one-on-one basis that knew for sure that the water would not reach their house. They were nowhere near the flood zone, and yet and still these individuals were still rescued from their roofs. So whether you are very poor and you're in an area that you do not have a lot of choices as to the type of land use that your home is built on, or even very affluent and you're trying to escape the city to go someplace warmer, both populations are being threatened by more hurricanes in Texas. Now, we have over 367 miles of Texas coastline, and the frequency of a hurricane making landfall on any 50-mile segment is about 1 every 6 years, okay? So we definitely know that landfalls will, tropical storms and hurricanes will make landfall in Texas. And when we look back at history and what hurricanes are like here, the busiest hurricane seasons are always late summer, early fall. And the busiest hurricane decades have been the 1940s first. There were 14 during the 1940s, 11 during the 1880s, and in the last decade we had 10. So there is reason to believe that maybe we haven't seen the worst of the frequency or the severity of our coastal populations and the fact that they may be in the line of the trajectory of any of these storms. So while there is concern that there may be human-induced climate change, the jury is still out on that, okay? At least as far as whether or not human activity is actually leading to more hurricanes in this sense. But what we do know from economics is that we can make better choices. Economics is all about choice. And I mentioned this to my students today. I always ask on the first day of class, what do you think you're going to learn about in my class? And inevitably, I always get one answer that's always yelled out. What do you think people always say when I ask What are you going to learn in economics? They say. They probably say economics. There's always one guy or girl, but there's something else that makes people believe is synonymous with economics. What is that other thing that everyone thinks that we're just going to focus on here? Money, right? Money, that's what we talk about in economics. And I told my students today as we started the chapter on money, which was chapter 13, I said, you thought we would talk about this sort of thing, and money is saved for finance, right? So what is economics about then? Economics is about choice. So there are choices that we can make, even in the absence of data, how we are having an impact on our environment, on our stratosphere, our atmosphere, but there are choices that we can make in order to make sure that we are prepared in the case of another landfall. We can have emergency preparedness for those groups that thought that they weren't going to be affected by the flooding, but they are. And of course, evacuation procedures for our most vulnerable populations who may not have the income to get out of those areas in the time of a natural disaster. So again, good governance, and perhaps some charitable capitalism as well. So let's consider work and how this has impacted the border economy. So another picture from that same hike. Looks like there's a snake there and some things crawling around on a rock. Before my friends and I went out on our own in Big Bend Park, we read up on the website what to expect. And very surprisingly, there was a notice there that was telling us that we are not to engage in any black market activities while we're out exploring the park. Black market activities? I thought we were here to hike. What's going on with this? As a result of the cross-border exchange, American dollars that go to Mexico, Mexican goods and services that come back to the United States, they want to make sure that these types of exchanges are done legally. Now, as I'll show you, the Mexican economy took a major hit in receiving American dollars after the 2001 terrorist attacks. This particular crossing that I told you about, it was closed in 2011 indefinitely. So the town withered, people moved away, and the revenue that they were used to seeing day in and day out before September 11th dried up. So black markets arose. The people that stayed decided that if the money will not come to us, then we'll go to the money. So people have crossed over the Rio Grande, have left their artisan goods, and if you look a little bit closer, there's a collection jar here that says how much this lovely handcrafted snake is, the spiders, the scorpions. These are a type of plant here called ocotillo. Beautiful. But because Americans are no longer willing to travel whenever we believe or we are convinced that the border is less secure than before, then the Mexican population brings their wares to us. And this is what the website was warning us about. It says that if we do leave money here and take these nice goods in exchange, although no one's here, that it encourages people to continue this and not sell their goods in legal markets. This is a conundrum. This is one of the most populous areas in terms of supplying goods and services to the rest of the world, yet we're closing off some markets here. There's an opportunity here, right? So what type of opportunity do we have when we talk about work and where people work across the border in their respective countries? This graph is showing economic growth rates. The red line is Mexico, and the blue line is the United States. Notice that growth in the United States is more or less around this line right here. But growth in Mexico is much more volatile, right? Jumps up and down very much. The biggest jump that we see here starts here in a negative category and goes way up positive. It's just after 1995. That's because NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, opened up that border crossing and allowed all those American tourists, consumers, and dollars to cross the border. And so we see amazing growth on the Mexican side as a result. Now, these two economies are somewhat correlated. I mean, they in a sense move, but not together, and that's important. Because as long as the United States economy and the Mexican economies are very different, as I said, there's always going to be an incentive for us to cooperate, cross borders, and get to know each other better in our markets. Now, specifically, this data is looking at border counties. Okay, so this is not the entire United States or the entire nation of Mexico, but there are about 14 or 15 pairs of sister cities all along the U.S. border with Mexico. Okay, so we're looking at how those Mexican sister cities reacted as their American counterparts were also engaging in economic activity. Not every pair of sister cities has significant economic activity. Some places are very barren moonscapes, like I mentioned earlier. And even the area where I took this picture at Boquillas, while the town of Boquillas is on the Mexican side, on the U.S. side, it's just the park. It's just Brewster County, Texas. So there's not a lot of trade there other than folks who were in the park and decided they want to take the crossing over. So this is one of the more harder hit sister cities, okay? Once you cross over at Boquillas, you are officially in the state of Coahuila. So my friends and I are posting here on the Mexican side here. And as I said, this was once a very thriving hamlet. After the 2001 attacks, we effectively closed both the northern and the southern border, and particularly this crossing, because it's just a pedestrian crossing, was one of the hardest hit of those. Even today, and the Boquillas crossing has been open now for about 3 years. It's only open 3 days a week. So the folks on this side of the border are still struggling. They're still in a process of recovering from the hit and the loss that they had in revenue due to the decrease in American tourism. Okay. So, the Maquiladoras. This is a Spanish word meaning a manufacturer. And this is the primary type of production that we have along the southern border. In particular, the United States and Mexico engage in what is called production sharing. So those industries that I mentioned earlier, electronics, aerospace, and cars, we will build the parts for the next plane, train, or automobile in the United States, and we will ship those parts to Mexico. Mexico will combine those parts into almost a final good and send it back to the United States. So even before someone has bought that new car or a company has bought that new plane, those parts have already been exported from the United States, assembled in Mexico, and imported back into the United States. Production sharing. We specialize in production sharing, and the majority of the manufacturers along the border region are probably working up under American umbrella companies, if you will. But we are not the only two regions or the only two countries that are present or prevalent in that region. China and Japan also own a significant amount of maquiladoras as well along this region. So they're engaging in the production sharing too. Well, where did this industry come from? Back in the 40s, we used to have a farm labor program that allowed Mexicans to come over to the United States and help us out with our agricultural produce. After their work visas they weren't visas, but after their work permits had expired, then they would go back home. This process lasted for about 20 years until 1965. And that's when we started the Border Industrialization Program, and it was a method by the Mexican government to reduce high unemployment along the northern border. So we started building factories with them. And the United States residents would come over to the Mexican side, help them build up their manufactories, make contact with the suppliers and the producers of those goods there, and then that's where the production sharing comes into play. Since we have established this amazing corridor of manufacturing, GDP growth in Mexico and per capita GDP growth has exploded, especially in that region. And American businesses are significantly more competitive. We're able to put together goods faster using lower cost labor and therefore increasing our profits, which is what business wants to do. And with the knowledge that China and Japan also own their own manufacturing and production sharing operations with Mexico, we're really competing against them, right? Free trade agreements have made production along the Gulf Coast that much more efficient. I've introduced to you already NAFTA, which was passed in January 1994. This was a keen time in Mexican economic history. They were moving towards increased trade liberalization. Mexico wanted to open up their borders coming out of the 80s, and this was one of the first and most beneficial outcomes of that policy. So, two sides of the NAFTA debate, and I think that both of these sides are still arguing with each other, okay? One side of the debate says, Go NAFTA is going to reduce the flow of undocumented workers and we're going to get more jobs. The other side says the exact opposite, right? We're not going to get more jobs, we're going to have less jobs, and the reason is because American businesses will move to the border region, and they would rather hire the lower cost Mexican labor than pay for the higher cost American labor. As it turns out, both of these things have happened since 1994, such that the net change of NAFTA has been pretty much zero, okay? So where does that leave us today? Our current administration has talked about tariffs in NAFTA, but if you remember the production sharing that I just described to you, we would really be cutting off our own nose to spite our face, and that's the case. We are exporting goods to unfinished goods to Mexico and then importing them back in. We would be subjected to those higher taxes as well with our trading partners who are helping put these goods together. So another option is, well, if we're not going to raise tariffs, we should either renegotiate or perhaps pull out of the agreement. And this is where things start getting a bit interesting. Mexico's drive towards more free trade completely intersects with this, right? Whereas the United States is considering pulling out of NAFTA, Mexico is in a position to say, no, we want to open our borders. We want more liberal trade in this sense. Which brings us to the second free trade agreement, which is currently in the news now. NAFTA is still in the news as well. I don't mean to say that it isn't. But the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I mentioned that China and Japan also have a strong presence along the US-Mexico border. They had their own production sharing agreements. And China and Japan, Japan at least has committed to the TPP, and China's on the fence now, really because a couple of days ago, the United States pulled out. Another free trade agreement that we're saying we do not want to be a part of. So in this sense, we literally do not have a seat at the table. And this is a big deal. This is the largest multilateral deal in the history of the world, even without the United States. And the 11 countries that are now involved, it was 12 up until last week, are extremely diverse in their backgrounds, in their socio-economic demographies, and also in the type of goods and services that they produce. One of the lasting pros that's being discussed about this new trade agreement that really benefits Mexico are digital services. Access to electricity and internet are nowhere near as popular in the Mexican households as they are here in the United States households. But this trade policy is saying that for those nations that are developing but would like to be a part of this multilateral agreement, there's the benefit that the digital divide between the haves and the have-nots would be closed. So if you were paying attention to the news over the weekend, Canada's on the fence, okay? They're thinking about possibly becoming part of the ratification process, but Justin Trudeau is not sure. And so there was some pressure coming from some Asian nations that Mexico should try to get Canada on board. So notice that around us, our neighbors are having conversations about more trade, freer trade, how to improve living conditions and labor conditions and the quality of life for all their people, but we're not a part of this conversation. Not being a part of the conversation is neither good nor bad, but it's certainly uncharted territory for the United States, just to keep that in mind. Briefly, I would like to say a few words about major immigration legislation that we've seen. Back in 1986, we had the Immigration Reform and Control Act. That was passed 31 years ago this month by Ronald Reagan, okay? Now, in 1951, President Truman argued that the only way to stop illegal immigration was to penalize the American businesses that are interested in hiring the lower cost labor. So President Truman had an entire economic commission that looked at illegal immigration, came up with these recommendations, and brought them to Congress. Congress said, oh, that's nice, but we're not going to enforce that. So in the subsequent years since Truman, it became illegal to be an illegal immigrant, but it was not illegal to employ one. So when we talk about incentives in a capitalist economy, the incentive is still there for American businesses to try to work with and recruit low-cost labor from Mexico, which obviously is going to have some impacts on our immigration policies and laws. Now, once the bill passed in 1986, amnesty was extended to farm workers, and we have data on those that received amnesty. Ultimately, a third of them became naturalized, and about 80% of them ended up earning higher wages within 10 years of that policy. So this could be some informed data that could let us know how to proceed going forward with future immigration policy. In 1990, this act was implemented in 1992. It was meant to increase the number of legal immigrants that were selected for visas or green cards. So I mentioned visas earlier, and this is actually where they were introduced during this immigration policy. In particular, there was a lottery system that was created, and people were chosen based on level of education, what type of job skills that they brought to the United States economy, and visas were granted for these highly skilled workers only if there was evidence that there were not qualified United States workers in that occupation. So during the 90s, the early 90s, we had this drive that moved away from strictly family-based immigration policies to looking at skills-based immigration policies and just having a more diverse population. In 2001, following the September 11th terrorist attacks, the United States Patriot Act was signed into law. And there's actually lots of legislation that was moved forward very quickly following those attacks, given the tenor in the country at that time. The Patriot Act was intended to arm law enforcement with new tools to detect terrorism and prevent terrorism. Okay? The Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, was founded in 2001, and also the Department of Homeland Security in 2002. So we're getting to an age now, or I should say an era now in American history, in which it's more than just immigration, right? We're concerned about the security of our borders, not just because of people that are crossing them, but folks that are crossing them with the express intent to do harm to Americans, right? So it makes sense that in 2002, the Enhanced Border Security Act contained a clause talking about restrictions to immigrants who came from countries that were deemed state sponsors of terrorism. In 2005, we had the Real ID Act. It was an initiative in order to make sure that people could not forge or use fake identification to gain access to federal buildings or to get onto a plane, right? I bring up these last two because there are some parts of it that we're seeing from Executive Order 13769, which in popular terms is known as the travel ban that we saw happen earlier this year. There are many reasons, the legalese completely beyond me, as to why this ban is challenged so often in court. However, I would like to point out that there are things within this travel ban that we have certainly seen before. Even prior to the Truman Commission in 1951, it was very common for United States immigration law to keep people out of the country based on their religion or based on their language. And as we said, during the Enhanced Border Security Act, if you were coming from a place that the United States government deemed was a sponsor of state terrorism, then your location would prohibit you from access to the country. So, although the execution was something less than perfect for the travel ban, it's really old hat. We've seen this before. Okay. Finally, I want to say a couple of words about the wall. And I want to be honest, by the time I got this far, I realized that there's really nothing new under the sun on the southern border. The immigrations that we've had with weather have been here and have predated us since any of us showed up. The immigrations that were the issues that we're having with immigration also predate us. And even the debates are older than most of us in here. And when it comes to the wall, this as well is something that we have encountered time and time again. The main question with the wall is the border safe? And if it is safe, how do we know? So I found a paper written by a research economist who had been with the Department of Homeland Security since it was founded in 2002. And he writes that large majorities of Americans have a belief that the borders are not secure, but there's no factual data to let them know whether or not this is right or wrong. For all of those immigration acts that I listed on the previous slide, there's always been a mandate that there should be some data that shows the number of apprehensions, for example, at the border, or the probability of apprehensions at the border, prior to making any immigration policy. But for all of those, we have not provided the data that allows us to make the most well-informed choices before we made the policy, hence why we need another immigration reform and another and another. So this research economist from DHS talks about the responsibility that the government has to the people of the United States to let them know whether or not the borders are in fact secure, to find data and to gather this data and analyze it and make it transparent for the whole world. I went onto the DHS site to see. We had the travel ban that passed earlier this year, and it was said in January that Congress had 6 months until July in order to give us a report on border security and the type of measurements that we should be looking at to determine how our policy should proceed. July came and went, so the date was moved back to October. And I said, oh, I didn't know that. So I started Googling and looking, and October has also come and gone. There's no information on the DHS website, yet we continue to plow forward with immigration policy without knowing exactly where our vulnerabilities are and how to address them and what type of technology we need in order to do so. Do we need a wall, or do we need more camera systems? Do we need more of a presence in border control? What type of issues are we facing along the southern border now, and are they the same ones that we have been facing since 2001? After the September 11th terrorism attacks, that's actually when we started building the wall. I have completely forgotten about that. But in parts of Texas, Arizona, and mostly in California, we began to build a wall after the September 11th attacks. So this idea that there should be a wall there, for whatever reason, is also something that is not new. The only thing that has changed since then are attitudes and opinions about immigration and about what the wall should look like. I believe that we need to be well informed, ladies and gentlemen. I think that we need to demand that the government, and particularly that the DHS, provides us with the type of data that we need to know exactly what type of threat that we may be looking at from any of our borders. And in order to do that, then we can talk about successful apprehensions and how those things are changing. One thing, and I do not have a graph here for that, but during the 1990s, we did build up in border enforcement. There was a major recruiting effort to get more Border Patrol agents under the Clinton administration, and it worked. We saw that immigration fell. We also saw that even in the 90s, when the United States economy was doing fantastic and the Mexican economy was not, that we still had lower levels of illegal apprehensions and people trying to cross the border. So something worked there, but without the data to figure out exactly what that was and what has changed since then, it's very hard for us to replicate those type of results today. One more thing about the wall, there was a subsequent executive order, 13767, and that is what the current administration signed in order to begin building the wall again after 7 years a lull in construction. So we have been building the wall, stopped about 7 years ago, and it looks like the timing was right to pick up that ball and run with it again, I suppose. The last part of my chat has to do with the people of this region. I've spent a lot of time talking about weather that is outside of our control. Spent a lot of time talking about markets and what we make down there. Spent a little time talking about opinions of the wall, where we've come from and where we're going. But what really matters the most in the border economy are the people. The people would be the folks that live on both sides of the borders, the residents, right? That would be the workers in the manufacturing industries. That would be the folks that own those manufacturing industries. We're also talking about government. We're talking about Border Patrol agents that every day put their lives on the line in order to make sure that the rest of us are safe and we don't have to worry about how secure our borders are. We occasionally hear stories about Border Patrol agents' lives being lost in their day-to-day work. We don't always hear stories about the migrants, but we understand that they're taking great risk in order to leave their homes to come to the United States, knowing that they're not wanted in many places and that the laws are prohibitive to them showing up. But I went to an art exhibit in Houston that really drove this point home for me, that the borders are living, that they are organic, and that the borders are made up of people. And so in this exhibit, it was showing a makeshift cemetery. And it said that it could have been anywhere in the Southwest, Arizona, Texas, California, and that the bodies in these graves could be anybody. They could be migrants, they could be Americans that were harmed. The box at the very bottom of the picture is the body box. It says Department of State. And so when they find people in the desert who have been left behind, who have succumbed to the elements, who have died under mysterious circumstances, they pack them in a box. Maybe we know their names, maybe we don't. You'll see here that there's remembrance of all these people, even if we don't know exactly who they are. Those folks that their lives and their livelihoods were completely intertwined around the southern border. Those folks who their potential we may never actually know, and that we miss out on as an economy. For in fact, the most important resource that any economy has is its people. So what are we doing in order to embrace our inter-border access with each other, right? Is there a way that perhaps we can exploit the traditions amongst this binational area? Is there a way that maybe we can even improve output on both sides? Well, the only way we can do that is through people and through people working together, right? Some of my students in here know I'm a big Keynesian. There's an economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. He's a disruptor. He came in and he said, the way you've been doing things for the last couple 100 years, I'm going to show you something else. Keynes is known for his quotes, witty, and this is one that I came across that I thought was so fitting for this particular area of research, because we're not really seeing anything new here. But the challenge is not so much in developing something new to overcome, but rather to overcome from where we've been. How do we reconcile with building a wall and then building it again? How do we reconcile with seeing people displaced from natural disaster and then seen it happen again? How do we reconcile with immigration reform after immigration reform after immigration reform that still leaves us with problems with border security and opinions that we can't come to terms with? So maybe it's not so much that we're not using capitalism to develop new ideas, but we're so ingrained in the old ones that we just can't seem to turn away. I think we need to disrupt the system. I think we need to look at what is most important and beneficial along the border, that being the people and the relationships that already exist there, and focus on that social science. Focus on good governance, focus on smart capitalism, okay? So, one last picture, unadulterated, all right? If there is a wall that's going to be here, our guide and the Border Patrol agents that we talked to said it would cut right through here, all the way to the Chisos. I hope that I've left you something to consider. I hope that if you walked into this presentation feeling very strongly about the wall, about weather, or about immigration, that maybe I've at least led you to the center of the road to consider that there may be two sides to this argument, and that there may be an approach that we have not yet thought of because we're so ingrained in where we've been. So for that, I thank you for your time and for your kind attention. And if you all have any questions or comments, I would be more than happy to entertain them. Yes, Scott.
Do you think there is a middle road? Do you have a solution to the problem? I'm sure you have.
I do. I think that we could do a lot better as the world's largest economy in terms of emergency preparedness for the people that are most in need in our economy. I don't mean just the contiguous 48 states. I don't just mean the 50 states. I mean our neighbors. I'm talking about Puerto Rico, I'm talking about Mexico, I'm talking about we have a responsibility. And I think that as the largest capitalist nation in the world, where capitalism means choice and freedom of choice, we have the freedom to make some choices that if we help our neighbors out, that also helps us out too. That's personally how I feel. In terms of immigration and the border security, we definitely need more data. That is both my professional and my personal opinion. I do not like sending anyone out to make uninformed choices, and we can't make choices about something this big, about people that are our neighbors, without knowing exactly what we're dealing with.
So do you feel like the delay in Congress to produce that data because they're actually gathering it, or are they just trying to find it?
Wow. So when I looked for, initially, like I told you, it was supposed to be 6 months after the travel ban that we received data from DHS. And there was no posting on the DHS site about why it wasn't there. I looked in old news releases to figure out. I don't know if it's deliberate or not, but the lack of transparency is very obvious. And even now, we're still waiting. What should have been delivered to us last month, there was no word about when we do find this DHS data. So maybe they're busy. I understand that. But the people need transparency, and this is obviously something that is continuing to move forward with or without that data. So the sooner that we get it, the better. Yes, sir. Thanks. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, sure thing, sure thing. Wow, I'm humbled for a second here because I spent time just trying to figure out how to pronounce the word.
You did a very good job of
questioning.
The historians in here, we're going back to that 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th century.
Before the Industrial Revolution?
Yes, we're going back to the Ice Age in the next 20 years. If not the next 5 years.
The consensus, is it that the Industrial Revolution has exacerbated things, even if it's not?
In the Roman times, and Caesar wasn't robbed by the fall. That's simple.
That's a perfect analogy. Okay, all right. That's a whole new door of research for me. Absolutely.
It's been extended for me. I do astrophysics this summer.
Okay. I know that we like to look at the Industrial Revolution, and of course economists want our work to be the center and the cause of everything. Actually, this makes me feel a little bit better that it's not because of that.
But I mean, the data you put up there was what we had.
Over that time period, but it just goes back further. Sure thing. And that's and I thought about that as well. I mean, it's a solid, it looks like a pretty good trend line coming from 1750, but again, what happens before that, or even what happens beyond that? Are there things that we've done since then that we haven't yet figured out what they are that have alleviated that? But thank you. Thank you very much. Hi. Sure thing. Of course, we've heard in the news that the proposal has been that Mexico should or will pay for the wall. Again, we're capitalist economies. There's got to be incentives. What's going to make Mexico pay for the wall? Okay. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. If Mexico doesn't pay for the lunch, then the Americans have to pay for it. And if that's the case, we need to pay for it through taxes because we do not have a budget surplus. So either taxes must be raised or we need to take money away from something else. And that's why I think that tax reform right now is very important. I think that this reorganization of taxes might be freeing up money that previously has gone towards one project and now can be used for something else. Just conjecture there. But the bottom line is that the wall needs to be paid for. And if it's being paid for by American dollars, we're either paying for it out of debt, so we're deficit spending, we're raising taxes, or there's a trade-off. We're taking the money away from someplace else. I think that I've looked at overall cost over the next decade or so in the tens of billions. I don't know exactly, a good number to give you, but that money is not going to appear out of anywhere. It's got to come from someplace else. And I think we need to all be very vigilant about different changes that are moving our government's budget around, see exactly how our money's being spent, and to talk about, do we want our money to go towards paying for this 10, 20, $30 billion investment over time, or maybe there's a better use of our funds, right?
Actually, I kind of have a question. Isn't methane comes from animals? So how would the industrial age?
So what type of things do we do that produce methane gas?
Increase farming, so we use animals.
I know off the top of my head, I cannot answer this off the. Okay. Sure. Manure, that's what you're saying? It's. Yeah. Learn something new every day. Sure. Okay. So, right. So I suppose that if one conjecture is that if economies are getting larger, that means that people are coming together in more concentrated areas. If those economies are still agricultural, it also means that there's more animals as well. Consider also that our ability to, in husbandry and breeding animals has expanded as our economic income has. So we buy more land, we have more animals, and perhaps in wealthier areas, that could be one reason. Wealthier people have more animals. Anyone else want to jump in here with that? Fracking. And the United States is becoming more and more energy independent because of fracking, because of discovering natural gas deposits and shale deposits. And so if we're engaging in more of this type of activity to satisfy our energy consumption, and it's causing methane gases to escape into the atmosphere, then that would definitely be something that we would be seeing, at least in recent history. Is it because of the you can just go for it. When I was on the coast, a couple of my friends were like, this is just beautiful area. I mean, the weather's nice. In August, it was actually a bit cooler than what it was here. And one of the girls in my party said, I wonder why they don't build down here, you know? And so, of course, we talked about how the national parks are protected. But if they were not, absolutely, there would be condos all up and down the Rio Grande. You've got, you know, United States and Mexico. You've got river views. You can see for a mile. We would totally take advantage of that. And I think that the same way in terms of our land use, unless there's some incentive that's going to make us conserve land, that's going to make us conserve how we use the land, then I think folks are going to go after that capitalistic instinct, which is profit, money, build, baby, build, that sort of thing. Yeah. Right. Very true. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Well, again, thank you for your time. For those of you that tuned in online, I appreciate that, and I appreciate all your questions and your engagement. Thank you.
Speaking of data, I and the department is also doing a little bit of a survey on this. So we want data as well. We want data for this. And so if you would please kindly fill out this very simple survey, we certainly would appreciate it. Okay? And feel free to leave. Go up and say hello to Professor Holmes.
Thank you all again. Thank you, Scott, for promoting this. Thank you to Elizabeth. She helped me out a great deal and pointed me in the right direction how to research this project. And this is my mother. She's just fantabulous. I'm going to thank her anyway.
Jeanette Fisher, I'm taking your May mini.
Hey, good to meet you, Jeanette.
I'm a little afraid. I'm in counting down. I only missed 2 on 25 today. I have to take a test. So, yeah, so I don't have to make, my fine, well, I have to make a 98 to make an A.
You'll do it.
So, oh, Lord help me. So, do we need a book for the mini? For our economics, do I need a book for our May mini?
You do. For the mini class, it's completely online, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, so, you know,
This
it's
is
gonna be
true.
my very first mini. So,
Sure,
yeah.
sure. So the textbook that the mini and the long-term use, it's all online. It's an e-text. It's called Connect Economics, and you buy the access code that gives you access to the book, and then all of our assignments are in Connect. So when you come ready for the mini, you'll see that you can work through it at your own pace. I've shown you everything that you need to do, turn in, and you just go for it.
So it's tentative, depending on how good we do together on this first
Sure.
one, is if I'm going to do my macro and whenever we come back before.
Oh.
So I'm not real sure yet.
In the spring before the mini?
I'm thinking, no, the mini before the spring.
The winter mini?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
I'm doing my first one.
Thank you
That was
Can
so
we
fun.
do
I
another
loved
mini,
it.
like after we come back from Christmas?
Certainly.
So I'm thinking maybe that. So
Okay. That'll work. That'll work. Well, I look forward to seeing you in my
texting
class,
me, you'll be
Jeanette.
texting me many times. Thank you so much.
It was
I
good to
enjoyed
meet
it.
you. Thank you. Hi,
I
Anne.
almost forgot, but I told Scott that I would try to make it. I have a voice lesson for this lesson.
Oh, sure. How are your lessons going?
It's going much better. Every time I'm a little bit better. So I'm going to be singing one song in the recitals. I'm really nervous because I'm not a soloist, right? I'm taking this because I sing in the choir.
Oh, my goodness.
Right?
And you have a recital?
So I'm
When
getting
is
really
it?
pushed. It's the 11th.
I'll be
It's
there.
the voice recital for all the students. And actually, one of the guys we've got.
All this talent.
Oh, it's awful. It's awful. It's awful. Alex Cook
Yeah.
is going to sing.